context, atmosphere, and why this case matters. In the early 1960s, Boston was widely perceived as a stable, predictable city. Not quiet, not idyllic, but familiar. A place where routine shaped daily life, and where danger, if it existed at all, was expected to come from the outside, from dark alleys, from strangers who forced their way in. Most people lived by patterns: morning commutes, regular shifts, groceries bought from the same corner stores, apartment buildings where neighbors recognized one another by sight, if not by name. There was comfort in that repetition, comfort in the assumption that what had always worked would continue to work. Post-war optimism still lingered. The country had survived global conflict and emerged stronger. Trust, social trust, institutional trust was part of the cultural fabric. Doors were often left unlocked, especially during the day. A knock at the door did not automatically trigger fear. It triggered obligation, politeness, curiosity. Repairmen, delivery workers, building staff moved freely in and out of residential spaces. A man with a confident tone and a reasonable explanation rarely raised suspicion. The social rule was simple: normal people do normal things, and normal things were safe. That assumption would quietly fracture. The first discoveries did not arrive with drama. There were no shattered doors, no overturned furniture in hallways, no signs of forced entry that would immediately signal intrusion. Instead, women were found deceased inside their own homes, bedrooms, bathrooms, private spaces meant to protect them from the outside world. In many cases, common areas appeared undisturbed. The living room looked as it had the day before. Chairs were upright, tables were not broken. It suggested that whatever had happened did not begin as a struggle, at least not one that announced itself. For investigators and for the public, this detail mattered, because it removed the familiar explanation. If no one broke in, then someone had been let in. And that possibility was harder to contain. These crimes demand analysis not because of spectacle, but because of their setting. Violence occurred in spaces assumed to be safe. The method did not rely on brute force or dramatic intrusion. It relied on permission, implicit or explicit, on the opening of a door, on social habits that had rarely been questioned. From a psychological perspective, this changes the frame entirely. It suggests that trust itself became the access point, that ordinary behavior, answering a knock, listening to a request, extending brief courtesy, may have been enough to place someone in danger. This is not a story about fear, as we typically imagine it. It is a story about familiarity, about how danger can blend into the background of daily life, indistinguishable from routine. Violence does not always arrive by force. Sometimes it arrives through habits we never learned to question. A timeline built from facts, inference, and silence. Reconstructing these events requires restraint. The record offers fragments, confirmed moments anchored in time, surrounded by wide areas of uncertainty. To understand what happened, we have to hold those categories apart: what is known, what is inferred, and what remains silent. What can be confirmed is limited but consistent. Victims were last seen alive, going about ordinary routines, returning from work, speaking with neighbors, settling into the evening. In several cases, the estimated time of death falls within a narrow window following those last sightings. Bodies were discovered hours later, sometimes the next day, often after a routine absence raised concern. Across scenes, there were shared characteristics: no forced entry, minimal disturbance in common areas, and causes of death that suggested close physical control rather than chaotic violence. Beyond these fixed points, the timeline becomes less stable. There are accounts, never fully corroborated, of a man seen in or near buildings around the time of certain deaths. Descriptions vary. Sometimes he appears helpful, sometimes merely present. Neighbors recall brief interactions that felt unremarkable at the time. Acquaintances mention conversations that only gained significance in hindsight. These are testimonial elements potentially meaningful, but not definitive. Later, there were confessions reported, statements attributed to an individual who claimed responsibility for multiple crimes. Yet these confessions were not tested in court for the murders themselves. They exist in the record, but without the legal weight that would anchor them firmly to specific events. As with many cold cases, they complicate more than they clarify. From a behavioral standpoint, certain patterns recur. Entry appears to have occurred without force. This suggests that victims were likely conscious and mobile at the outset, capable of opening doors and engaging briefly. Control seems to have been established quickly. There is little indication of prolonged struggle in shared spaces. Noise, if any occurred, did not draw attention. Some aspects of the scenes appear almost ordinary. There was no chaotic destruction. Furniture was not overturned. Objects were not scattered in ways that would suggest panic or prolonged resistance. The means used to cause death were often items found within the home, things that did not require preparation or transport. This absence of specialized tools can suggest opportunism, but it can also indicate confidence in close control. At the same time, there are elements that feel distinctly off. The repetition across victims who otherwise had no connection stands out. Different ages, different backgrounds, different neighborhoods, yet similar outcomes. The calm implied by scene organization is difficult to ignore. In some cases, the way bodies were positioned suggests time spent after control was established. There is an absence of indicators we typically associate with panic. No signs of frantic movement, no evidence of a rushed exit. Psychologically, this combination is telling. The behavior suggests pre-event planning, but not necessarily a long-term rigid strategy. There is no clear progression toward increased violence, nor a visible retreat or cooling off pattern. The timeline lacks obvious escalation or de-escalation. Instead, it shows repetition acts that follow a familiar internal script. That familiarity is part of what delayed recognition. When violence follows a routine, it can blend into the background of everyday life. It can move through ordinary spaces without announcing itself as a threat. And when violence disguises itself as normal, life recognition comes slowly. Response comes later, sometimes too late. This chapter does not resolve the timeline. It clarifies its limits. What emerges is not a complete sequence of events, but a pattern of behavior that repeats, quietly leaving behind scenes that resist simple explanation and records that remain in crucial places silent. Human behavior at the center of the record. To understand this case, we have to step away from labels and return to people, not as categories or statistics, but as individuals moving through ordinary days, making decisions that made sense in their time and place. The victims ranged widely in age and circumstance. Some were young women living alone for the first time, newly independent, balancing work, friendships, and modest apartments. Others were older, living in rooming houses or small units accustomed to shared hallways and casual interactions with neighbors and staff. Many worked regular jobs. Many had family connections nearby or maintained routines that made them visible to others. What they shared was not a single lifestyle, but a social context. They lived in environments where brief, polite interactions with unfamiliar people were normal. What they did not share is just as important. They did not belong to one neighborhood, one class, or one phase of life. There is no single victim profile that explains selection. That absence resists easy conclusions and complicates attempts to impose a simple narrative. The final decisions attributed to the victims opening a door, allowing a conversation to continue, have sometimes been framed as mistakes. From a psychological standpoint, that framing is misleading. In early 1960s, Boston answering a knock was not reckless. Social norms emphasized politeness and cooperation. Women were often expected to be accommodating, especially to men presenting themselves as professionals or authority-adjacent figures. Compliance was not weakness, it was taught behavior. It suggests that the danger did not arise from poor judgment, but from a mismatch between social training and emerging threat. The victims acted within the boundaries of what felt safe at the time. Around them were others peripheral figures whose experiences form the quiet edges of the record. Family members noticed when routines broke: a missed phone call, an unanswered door, a shift that went unattended. Neighbors recalled sounds that did not quite register as alarming, or interactions that seemed ordinary until they were reinterpreted later. Investigators working under growing public scrutiny faced pressure to connect disparate events without the benefit of modern tools. Each group responded in human ways through concern, doubt, and often delayed realization. Then there are the last known actions of the person responsible. After the crimes, there is no evidence of hurried escape. No clear attempts to systematically destroy evidence. No messages sent to the media. No effort to claim ownership or provoke public reaction. The record is notably quiet. Psychologically, that quiet matters. Many violent offenders seek recognition through communication symbolism or escalation. Here, there is an absence of post-crime signaling. No apparent desire to be seen. No attempt to shape the narrative. The behavior suggests completion rather than chaos. An act carried out, then left behind. This does not point to remorse or indifference. It simply narrows the range of plausible motivations. The lack of communication may indicate that the act itself fulfilled whatever internal need was present. Once finished, there was nothing to add. What stands out most across victims and scenes is what does not appear. There is no evidence of panic in common spaces, no pattern of dramatic overreach after the fact, no consistent effort to announce power or superiority. These absences do not solve the case, but they shape our understanding of it. In analysis, silence is not empty. It is data with edges we cannot see. The most revealing behavior is sometimes what does not happen. And in this case, the quiet left behind after lives were disrupted and routines were broken remains one of the most diagnostic elements we have. System limits, missing data, and investigative silence. As the months passed and the list of unanswered questions grew, this case began to change shape. Not because interest faded, and not because effort stopped, but because the system encountered the edge of what it could reliably know. The most obvious limitation was technological. In the early 1960s, there was no DNA testing, no genetic databases, no forensic genealogy waiting decades in the future. Physical evidence existed, but its interpretive power was narrow. Fibers, fingerprints, and blood typing could suggest proximity, not identity. Over time, evidence degraded. Items were handled, stored, sometimes misplaced. Each year added distance between the present and the moment of the crime. Record-keeping reflected the era. Reports were handwritten or typed, filed locally, and rarely standardized across jurisdictions. What one investigator noted carefully, another summarized briefly. What seemed insignificant in the moment was often left undocumented. Silence entered the record not through omission alone, but through routine. Structural constraints compounded these gaps. There was no centralized database linking crimes across neighborhoods or cities. Patterns were identified manually, if at all. Offender profiling as a formal discipline had not yet taken shape. Investigators relied on experience and intuition tools that can guide but also mislead. As public concern intensified, so did the pressure to reassure. The demand for answers sometimes outpaced the available evidence. Social and cultural factors further shaped the investigation. Gender bias influenced how victims were discussed and prioritized. Certain lives were unconsciously framed as more risky, others as more respectable, a distinction that subtly affected urgency and resource allocation. Economic differences mattered as well. Crimes in poorer or more transient communities often generated fewer leads, not because people cared less, but because fewer records existed to trace movement and connection. Fear also played a role. Witnesses hesitated. Neighbors questioned their own memories. A detail remembered too late felt unreliable. Silence spread not from indifference, but from uncertainty and self-doubt. This silence carried psychological weight. For families, it meant unresolved grief. Without clear answers, mourning stalled. Questions repeated themselves across years and generations. For communities, it produced a generalized anxiety, an awareness that danger could pass through familiar spaces unnoticed. Everyday routines became slightly strained, trust slightly thinner. Investigators were not immune. Professional doubt set in. Files were revisited, then set aside. Each unanswered question carried the implication that something had been missed. Over time, the absence of new information became its own burden. It is tempting in retrospect to frame cold cases as failures or to elevate the offender into a figure of exceptional cunning. Both narratives simplify what is fundamentally complex. Cold cases emerge from systemic gaps, from the limits of technology, the structure of institutions, and the social conditions surrounding the crime. They do not require a flawless perpetrator. They require only a system that exhausts the questions it knows how to ask. Silence in this context is not emptiness. It is unrecorded context. It represents what could not be measured, what was not yet understood, and what slipped between procedural boundaries. The absence of answers does not indicate the absence of effort. A case does not go cold because no one cared. It goes cold because the system ran out of answers it knew how to ask. Understanding that distinction matters, not to excuse limitations, but to recognize them. Because without that recognition, we risk repeating the same silence, believing that unanswered questions reflect a lack of concern rather than the enduring challenge of trying to understand human behavior with incomplete tools. Later developments and a reflective conclusion. Decades after the events themselves, science returned to the record. Advances in forensic technology, particularly DNA testing, made it possible to examine preserved evidence with tools that did not exist at the time of the crimes. In at least one instance, biological material recovered from a crime scene was linked to a named individual. For many observers, this appeared to offer long-awaited clarity. But clarity arrived unevenly. The testing did not extend cleanly across all cases attributed to the same pattern. Some scenes yielded usable material, others did not. Some results suggested proximity, others remained inconclusive. The outcome was not a single answer, but a layered one, partial confirmations alongside persistent uncertainty. Technology narrowed possibilities, but it did not close the record. This distinction matters. DNA can establish biological presence. It can suggest contact. It can at times link a person to a place. What it cannot do is reconstruct intention. It cannot tell us what was said at the door, how trust was negotiated, or what a victim perceived in the final moments before control was established. It cannot restore context that was never recorded. As a result, the modern evidentiary picture is both stronger and more limited than it appears. Some elements are supported by data. Others remain conjecture, reasonable, informed, but still unprovable. And some questions are by their nature unknowable. They were lost not to negligence, but to time. Separating these categories is an ethical responsibility. Analysis becomes distorted when assumption is treated as certainty, or when absence of evidence is filled with narrative. In this case, restraint is part of accuracy. To say we don't know is not to abandon understanding, it is to define its boundaries. That boundary is where reflection begins. The value of analyzing this case does not lie in delivering a final name or a definitive sequence of events. It lies in understanding how ordinary social behaviors can be exploited, how systems respond under pressure, and how investigations are shaped by the tools and assumptions of their time. It lies in recognizing the human cost of ambiguity borne by families, communities, and investigators alike. True crime analysis often promises closure. This case resists it, and that resistance is itself instructive. It reminds us that understanding a case is not the same as solving it. Insight can exist without resolution. Meaning can be drawn without answers. The most honest conclusion here is a quiet one. We know some things, we suspect others, and much remains unanswered not because it was ignored, but because it could not be captured. Living with that ambiguity is uncomfortable. It challenges the desire for clean endings, but it is also truthful. And in the careful study of real human harm, truth, however incomplete, matters more than satisfaction. Understanding a case is not the same as solving it. Sometimes the most honest conclusion is learning how to live with what remains unanswered.